team, and that's where I came to learn about this and to talk about how these kids are pretty unique. And I don't know, with the small group here, I'll just kind of take the temperature of the room. What is people's experience or knowledge about NLD? Kind of raise of hands if you've experienced kids with this or adults. Got a couple. Okay, good. Okay, just so I know where to kind of start from. My goal, I was going to say this morning, this afternoon, is kind of to go over what it is, where it stands in our fields, whether psychology or education, what are the theories behind why it happens, and what it actually looks like. What do these kids come across to us as being, and then how do we fix that? How do we help them manage, both at home and at school? So, as I alluded to, I've kind of come across this more often than most people have, specifically in our office. I'm almost an accidental expert in some way, shape, or form. We're not taught this in graduate school. You don't come out of graduate school saying, I want to specialize in NLD. At least in my experience and most of the colleagues that I have, this really isn't trained. You're not taught about it for many of the reasons that I'm going to tell you about. But when you see it, it's pretty obvious. There's a very specific profile. The kids are very unique. They have very awesome, very specific strengths, and then very unique challenges. And it really starts to stand out. And so my prevalence rate in seeing these kids is much higher than I expect anybody else's. I have no idea why that is. It's kind of funny, but that's how I came across this. So I've been kind of forced to learn a lot about it, and now I get to do these talks. So the basics. What is really confusing about this is that it technically doesn't formally exist to the people that matter, right? The insurance companies, the people that write our diagnostic manuals. So specifically in the US, it's not formally accepted or recognized. There's no code that you can snap on your paper and say, NLD, here, do this treatment plan. Across the seas, it is fairly accepted, but even still, they don't have a specific code or treatment plan to follow either. There is a lot more extensive writing and research, particularly in Britain and Australia. But even still, when I originally did this talk, DSM-4 was still the way to go. Now we've got 5. But even in ICD-9 and 10, nonverbal learning disorder is not officially recognized. So what do you do with that? Before, when I had a kid with this profile, the best way to kind of capture it, as we'll talk, there is this sort of autism spectrum flare. And so you try to capture them under something like pervasive developmental disorder in OS. Right now, even that's no longer. And so now we're really stuck with what we do with this. I've put down kind of the options of what you have as far as DSM-4 and what it might fit with the new DSM-5, specifically maybe the social communication disorder seems to be almost the best fit, but it really truly isn't. And I also don't think these kids necessarily fit into what they're now considering full autism spectrum disorder. ICD-10 still has in there some sort of pervasive developmental disorder. That might be the best explanation, but there's really no clear-cut way to really describe these kids and fit them into one of these boxes at this time. So I want to step back and kind of walk through where this has all come from. So learning disorders began to be coined and looked at more so in the 60s. These are kids who have good intelligence, they're smart, but they're struggling in the classroom. So they figured, okay, well, it's either due to a speech problem or they can't learn to read or do math, and let's box them into one of these categories. But then you have these kids that they're just not fitting, and then they start to have these very specific struggles, and they start to form a category of their own. And then uniquely, they also have these social deficits. So not only are they struggling to learn in certain ways, but they're also not forming friendships, and they seem a little awkward, and they're a little clumsy, and they can't tie their shoes, and they're 12 years old, and all these sorts of things. They're not reading between the lines. They're very literal. Starts to come out and seem very autism. So in my experience, what do these kids They're intrusive. They don't know when to jump in or when to jump out in a conversation. Stand too close or to stand too far away. They don't know what that space really should be like. They isolate themselves. If they can't figure it out, they do the opposite, and they're fearful of new situations. Or when they finally get someone who wants to listen to them, then they're incessantly talking, and they don't shut up. They give too many details. They don't realize where the boundaries are and when to knock it off. So in looking at these things, that really starts to sound a lot like what we realize to be Asperger's disorder. What you don't usually find is the very repetitive behaviors or really intense interests. You might have some of that, but it's not always as hallmark when you're talking about NLD specifically. So when you talk about prevalence rates, like I said, mine doesn't count because it's absurd, but it's really hard to kind of put a number on it. One person in the field has tried. She actually wrote, this is a really good PDF that's available online, The Misunderstood Child. You can just Google it. She's tried to put a number on it to say maybe like 1 in 10 of every learning disabled child seems to have a profile similar to NLD. That's a wise guess, but how many kids go unrecognized that have a learning disorder? So it's really hard to put a number on it. And you imagine I'm just one practitioner in a Midwest city who happens to have a crazy number of these kids. How many are out there that are being overlooked? So it's misunderstood for many of the reasons I've already talked about. It doesn't formally exist. So people like us, we've made attempts to try and call it something, make it fit, but it just hasn't worked for these kids. So it's often mistaken for, or for a lack of a better decision. We've called it Asperger's, we've called it PDD, we've called it ADHD because these kids are fidgety and they really don't know how to pay attention when they don't understand. Or they look like they just can't learn. They're not getting the math. They're not getting reading. There is some idea of what might be happening. There are suggestions and theories of what's happening in the brain that really hammers home to these ideas and how these kids look to us. We think it's a theory of the right brain, the right hemisphere that's just not functioning the right way. Because when you look at these kids, we'll talk about lateralization, and all the left brain activities seem to be really strengths for them. It's the right side that is a little bit dysfunctional. There's also a white matter hypothesis. So white matter is where all the connections happen, messages are sent, and the brain talks to each other. And when we think that the white matter is depleted, there's a problem, and now the brain can't talk to each other. And it's not compensating. It's not picking up where another area has left off. So here's that lateralization that I talked about. And the words are a little bit fuzzy, but when we talk about a right brain dysfunction, the right brain handles creativity, imagination, being able to see the big picture, conceptualizing, being intuitive, empathetic, right? The left brain, we're the little scientist. We're analytical, logical, repetitive. We need an order to things. Something's out of order, that's hard to handle. We're more detached. We don't have that empathy that the right brain is so good at. Very literal, sequential. So if you think, if the right is having a hard time doing the work, you're going to be much better at the left side of things. When we talk about how the right and left brain communicate with each other, the left brain is much more snobby. It doesn't like to communicate with the right. The right brain is usually the communicator. It sends the messages to the left side. And so when the right's not working the right way, the left kind of stays in its own world. So now we're not even trying to communicate with the right side, which makes all of the left side properties even more prominent. So what we know is when the right hemisphere has damaged, these are other things that tend to come out. Attention disorders, memory disorders, visual perceptual disorders. So we're clumsy, we can't really write very well, fine motor skills are pretty poor. And then we have the mood disorders. We're more prone to anxiety. anxiety, depression, that just not being empathetic. So then we're probably called rude because we just don't get what the other person's coming at. Uniquely, a version of all of these things are part of NLD. So what can we try to call criteria? I put it in quotes because there's not real true criteria. It's just things that we've seen form a pattern to be established over time. They have identified 3 major areas. We've got the motor problems, lack of coordination, balance, and writing skills. That visual, spatial organization. We can't really take an image and copy it, which I'll show you a few examples in just a moment. If a ball is thrown at us, it might smack us in the face because we don't really know how to grab and to really think about how fast that ball's traveling, where it might go, and how do I stop it. What else? Spatial relations. We might walk into a wall or two. We might trip over our feet. A lot of that stuff seems to happen with these kids. And then that social stuff looks a lot like Asperger's, but maybe not so intense, I would say, is how I would try to qualify my kids that I see. We still have the problems with transitioning. We like when things are very routine. We don't like surprises. And we can't really judge the situation appropriately. We might have a tad better skill than the ASD or the Asperger kid next to us, but we're still missing a lot of those cues. So I said they have really cool strengths, and they absolutely do. They're usually early speech development. They seem like they've got it. They can talk a mile a minute and be very eloquent and seem to stand out in their class early on. Rote memory skills are awesome. They remember things like you wouldn't believe. I said the eloquent verbal ability. If you talk to them, they're going to remember it. The auditory retention is ridiculous. They can remember a lot of that stuff. These kids are very detail-oriented. They lack the big picture, but when it comes to the fine detail, they get it. But with the challenges, like I said, they start off, they're standouts in their class. The teachers are like, wow, their verbal skills are awesome. This kid's going to do really well. But as they get older and the classwork becomes more complex, more visual, more independent, then the kids start to fall back. And then the teachers are like, what's with this? This kid was a standout in first grade. Now they're not even trying. They are trying. They have struggles that you couldn't identify before. And that's where you get a lot of teachers who, on the outside, are saying the correct thing, but they really just don't know exactly what's going on with the kid. So I want to take the criteria and look at it a little bit more in depth. When we talk about nonverbal functioning, it encapsulates a lot of stuff. It's the social stuff, it's the visual perceptual sorts of things, problem solving, concept formation, testing hypothesis, trial and error. These kids really struggle with those sorts of things. We'll talk about their specific academic struggles and what that looks like, and then the social emotional things. They want social relationships, they just don't make it happen in quite the right way. And they tend to be extremely immature. So let's talk about the balance, those sorts of things. Like I said, these are kids who struggle to probably tie their shoes. By middle school, maybe they get it. They often can't ride a bike without training wheels. When you look at like an NLD checklist, they ask parents that. Can they ride a bike? Can they roller skate? Skateboard? Any of those things that require balance. Now think backwards to what I said about the brain. We're saying this is a right brain disorder. So they have usually muscle weakness on their left side, because the right brain controls the left side of the body. So you really have kind of an issue when you have an NLD kid who's maybe left-handed. They're going to struggle a lot more than maybe the right-handed kid with NLD. But with established routines, practice, these kids do really well with over-learning. Repeat it, they'll get it. So I told you I'd show you a few examples. This is actually an 8-year-old boy that I had tested. And this is our Rayo. So we show them that picture, and we say, copy it. And we trade them colors every now and again so that we can, when we look back on it, remember the order in which they drew it. And so you can see he's really struggling again with the big picture. He's got all the individual details there for the most part, but they aren't organized. And I'd say for the most part, the kids can recognize at the end, whoa, that doesn't look the same, but not as profoundly as you might think. You know, if we drew this, we'd be like, oh man, we really didn't get this together. Kids seem mostly okay with their performance. They don't quite see how distorted the final product looks for them. This is a 12-year-old male who did this for me, much more significant. We become really concerned when you see what should be the diamond at the end. If it's not connected, if they can't even get the diamond shape there. You see a lot of rotation happening. You don't even see the large box. I mean, think about how would you approach drawing an image like this. You might outline it. You might start with a large rectangle. These kids struggle to organize an approach that way. I have one more. 14-year-old female. Again, we see all the details first, and then we don't know how to piece them all together. This was a unique case where I had a girl who eventually, the profile came out, and I called her to have a nonverbal learning disorder. She was really cool. She was very excited that she had learned how to read a clock. And so anymore, all of our clocks are digitized. So I said, oh, you know, I showed her a picture in the stimulus book. She could read the clock and told me what it was. I asked her to draw it. I think it was 3 o'clock. I said, can you draw me 3 o'clock? So she starts, and she's like, oh, I messed up. Can I try again? And that's her second attempt. And you can see they just can't get the visual spatial part of it. They can't plan it. They can't organize it, even though they can look at a clock and know what time it is. So I thought that was a good example to demonstrate that. So along with big picture and problem solving, we can't organize the thought. It's the planning is a problem. All that sort of executive functioning stuff tends to fall by the wayside because of the earlier struggles. Cause and effect is really hard. But if we overlearn it, we demonstrate it a few times, the kids get it. Adapting to new complex situations. We like routine. We like it to happen the same way every time. We travel from home to the grocery store this way, and there's construction, we have to go a different way. Doesn't make much sense to these kids. Malls are pretty scary because you're going around in all these different directions. It's hard for them to kind of create a visual map in their mind. They might get easily lost, you know, so they really have to have some landmarks, some things to look for. You're not going to tell these kids, go down, make a left, go to the second light, and make a right. They're not going to get where you need them to go. So in school, they can spell, they can read, very good for more rote information. So they're going to read a story, they're going to read it for content. They're not going to be so great at interpreting what they've read. Right? Remember, the left side of the brain, we're more literal. We're going to look at the words in front of us and find the answer. It's going to be more hard to take that information, make sense of it, and then answer a more inferential question. What was the point of what the author said? It's harder for them to do. Math becomes extremely problematic. So think about the pictures I just showed you. Imagine this kid trying to do a multi-digit multiplication problem. So you've got numbers lined up, and you have to think about them in columns. Then you have to go this way, and then create a second line. These kids just, they can't do it. Long division, they can't do it. What was surprising to me is a lot of kids do really well with multiplication. Well, it's memorization. So if it's just single numbers and something they can memorize, they do awesome at it. But when you have problems that they do the problem horizontally, and then you take the same problem and make it vertical, they think it's a whole new problem. They don't realize it's the same one you just did. And that's in the more, I think, severe cases, but this is where graph paper comes in handy. You know, there's no intervention other than just line it up for them and keep it so that they don't have to rely on their own spatial planning. Like I just said about the reading comprehension, they're going to read it for content. They're going to want to look back at the story and find the answer. What I have read and the videos I've watched with people now in college, they're saying they read it out loud to themselves. Remember, their auditory retention and understanding is so much better. So if they're reading something, they're reading it out loud. They're hearing it, then they're remembering it. And that small scale just means the world to them. Then our friendships. It's a hard area. This is where they really start to mimic the kids with Asperger's. They can't read the nonverbals. They can't look at body positioning and be like, this person's not interested in what I'm saying. Their eye contact seems to be a little bit better, at least in my cases, but they still are missing the boat. You try and joke with them or use sarcasm, and it's kind of over their heads at sometimes. They're really poor on personal space. They're often sitting right next to you or talking right here next to you. They just don't get that boundaries and how to do turn-taking and appropriate conversations. So because of this, kids can be mean, and the NLD kid or the Asperger's kid, these children don't always realize when they're being taken advantage of. You have kids who can buddy up next to them because they want to use their Nintendo DS, right? And the kid's just excited because he now looks like he has friends, but he doesn't get when he's being manipulated. So they're often teased, and all of that sort of stuff happening creates a lot of anxiety, a lot of confusion in the kids, and then they're teased. So it's really important to see how they stand up differently from the things that they might be misdiagnosed as. ADHD. These kids are so much different than our classic ADHD kid for very many reasons. Specifically, I said they're detail-oriented. What true ADHD kid do you know is detail-oriented? Not usually going to happen. I would think of my traditional hyperactive ADHD boy. He's seeking out risk. He's a daredevil. My NLD kid is avoiding that at all costs because they don't want anything unexpected. They both are rather talkative. The kid with NLD is going to be more slow in their performance before they give up. The ADHD kid's going to try real fast before they give up. So there's really unique properties that start to emerge and draw the line between the two. So it's a little bit outdated now, but previously we used to be able to separate what we know to be on the autism spectrum, where if you see the NLD oval, it encapsulates everybody with Asperger's. This would suggest everybody with Asperger's also has NLD. I don't know if that's so true, but this is a good depiction to state that NLD has a lot of these different properties. With the DSM-5, they're suggesting that most of this should all be in one bubble. And I think it's a little unfair because there are very clear divisions, unique strengths and challenges in each category. When we're really starting to separate these kids, I've bolded the fine motor problems that are severe when you compare them to other kids in these other categories. The visual motor problems are very unique. I don't know if I could say that all of my ASD kids would draw the rail in the way that you saw, but yet every kid with nonverbal learning disorder will have some version of that distorted image. So to talk about that bubble that I showed you just a moment ago, this one here, there has been studies done to look at this, and the one study done by Yale found that about 80% of their Asperger kids really met all the criteria as we suggested for NLD, but there haven't really been studies looking at the other way around. Both kids have that social awkwardness, the over-attention to detail, missing the main themes and points, big picture sorts of things. But from what Yale is suggesting, Asperger's is reserved for the more severe social challenges, where so stuck on an interest or a subject that it disrupts the rest of our functioning. I don't think you get that quite as clear cut when you're talking about just nonverbal learning disorder. So how do we assess it? I will say it has not happened yet where a family has come to me and said, I think my kid has NLD, can you test for it? It hasn't happened. Maybe eventually, but as the word gets out. But it hasn't happened yet. So you don't really walk into this saying, I'm testing for NLD. It starts to emerge. And when you've seen it a few times and you see that image copied, then you say, okay, I'm going to pull a few more tests because I think I know where we're going. Ideally, what you see is a large split in their IQ. Verbal strengths beyond the chart, and then the nonverbal strength, or the nonverbal skills lagging behind. You don't necessarily need that discrepancy, but in a majority of the cases you have it. You don't need the severe deficits in all of those categories I went over. But I would say most of the kids I've seen have at least some of them. I would say the visual perceptual always stand out as being the most difficult, followed by the social skills. And then schools struggle to adapt to these kids, so they've either had services or they haven't, so their academic skills are somewhere in between. But it's important to, not just look at those scores that the kid gives us, but looking at everything. What has the family done? How does the family interact? Has he or she had experiences with other kids? And so how has their social development progressed to this point in order to really capture this picture? You're not just going to give them all these tests, look at the numbers and say, okay, here it is. So this is a little bit overwhelming. I don't know if you're familiar with the specific tests, but there has been a lot of research done where people have been able to say, here's a profile, a very classic profile of what you would expect with a child with NLD. And so you can see there's a number of different things that you can look for. So if you have a kid that you're testing, you start to see this profile emerge, I've got a list that I can refer back to test these different areas to see if I've got a strong profile and I'm heading in the right direction, or if, no, what I saw was a little bit, but it's not necessarily where I'm going with this, go the other direction. So despite it not being a real thing and formally recognized, we have a lot of information of what we should look for if we're suspecting it. So what do we do with school? It doesn't really exist for us as psychologists and therapists and social workers. How can we expect schools to buy into what we say? They can't expect to jump on board. A lot of schools are becoming more aware and they want to do more for these kids, but how do you fit them into the right box as far as, an IEP? They're not cognitively impaired. They're usually not emotionally impaired. They could potentially need the pragmatics of speech a little bit more. They have learning disabilities for sure. If you think about how I said they do math, they can use the social skill building that an ASD child would get. And potentially, you've got a lot of sensory issues where you have inattention or combination. So the OHI, other health impairment, can really help them there. So how can you go to a school and say, they need all of that? They can do a lot, but when you go to a school and say, the kid has something that really isn't recognized, but here, give them all of these things. They're really not going to know what to make of that. And at some point, you would hope by now the kid would have had something of these. They've already had some sort of IEP established. The school hasn't really been able to put their finger on what's been going on. But to know they can benefit from a little bit of all of this kind of sends home the unique challenges that the school faces when they deal with these kids. We know what the ideal classroom should look like. And when you look at all these, it's not just an NLD problem. I think this would be the ideal classroom for pretty much any kid. But specific to what we know these kids struggle with, this is the ideal classroom. One that's not going to be visually stimulating, right? You're not going to have a ton of stuff on your walls. You're going to keep it simple, structured, chunk the information down for the kids. The continuity of teachers, that's a hard thing, right? Every year you're changing into new teachers. Perhaps you're old enough that every classroom is a new teacher. That's really hard. These kids are going to have a hard time transitioning between teachers, even their classmates. That's that's going to be a hard thing. Once you finally get a friendship going, might not be in the class with them next period or next year. And that's hard because building a friendship is so hard for them to begin with. Transitioning into a new classroom is going to be a really scary ordeal. We really want teachers and staff to look out for the bullying for the reason that I said that these kids are vulnerable. They may not see it coming, and so teachers, aides can kind of step in and help out in that perspective. We've been seeing a lot of kids getting paired up, whether it's a parent or an aide or a peer in the classroom. Let that person be their note-taking buddy, or look at their work and help them out. What we also find is when you have a student helping another student and they correct them, it seems much more okay rather than the teacher correcting. That starts to sound like reprimanding or correcting, redirection, and then kids get really irritated with that. But you have your friend helping you out, it seems like you're working like a team, and it comes across much more, less harsh, I should say. Teach them how to type. We don't want to completely forego their writing skills, but maybe in the meantime, typing something might be a lot more effective, time efficient for these kids while they work on their writing skills. We don't want to force them to write everything, make them hate writing, make them hate school, and then we're done. So any kind of intervention in the meantime to take the laboriousness out of writing for them would be useful. Like I said, the other people who are compensating out there, they're talking to themselves, they're reading out loud. That seems to be the best intervention that a person can do for themselves. And chunking the information down, right? So don't have to look for the big picture and everything. Break it down into smaller, more manageable chunks of information. They're really good with real life examples. So take math and make it real life. You know, put it into something they can understand instead of a bunch of symbols on a piece of paper that don't make sense and all blend together. The graph paper, I think, is a miracle cure here when trying to teach them math. Give them breaks. It's exhausting. They're working really hard. May not look like it. Teachers might call them lazy, but they are working really hard and might need the benefit of some breaks. They're not going to ask for it. We got to make sure they're scheduled and structured. Remember what I said about those hallways. As you get up in school years, schools get bigger, hallways get longer, so they might get a little lost in the building. The overlearning still remains a good technique for them. Small group work is really, really good for them. So they are less overwhelmed and they might feel more confident to be a leader in a small group than they will in a very large group. So for the family, they're going to want to seek out occupational therapy, how to manage that visual perceptual stuff. Some families might seek out vision therapy, how to correct those things. I don't know if vision therapy would work well without having OT involved because of the motor planning and all that sort of stuff and how the two work together. And the very, very young kids, they might start off with speech therapy, but then oftentimes they realize, boy, they're really developing speech very quickly, but it's the pragmatics of speech that they need some help on. How do I formulate a response, a greeting, compliment? The social skills group, so when we send them to a therapist, we don't want the therapist to just talk for them or talk to them for an hour. These kids are going to talk, and they'll talk the whole entire hour, not going to get anywhere. You want that to be more skill development, role-playing, teaching. That's what therapy should look like for these kids in the social skills groups. CBT tends to be helpful. You know, these kids are very ordered, very planned. They like the sequencing, so when you can teach them how one creates change in another, they might respond to a CBT sort of technique. Specifically, you know, at home to improve on these skills, eye-hand coordination. We don't want kids playing these computer games day in and day out, but they do tend to help these kids, and to some extent, it has that secondary benefit of if you play the really cool game really well, you're going to make friends because you're going to be idolized if you're doing really well in a game. So it kind of has two games to it, but we also want to make it time limited. We don't want the kids walking around on video all day and night. Sports. These kids are going to be awful to begin with, but with practice, they can learn the skills, and it's going to help them. Swimming. They put archery on there. I don't know if I want to start my NLD kid out with archery, but confidence building, as long as it's supervised. Just want to have them be active, practice those skills, balance their bodies a little bit better. Start them off individually. Let them master a skill first before you send them into a crowd of other kids who are already doing these things really well. Give them a chance to succeed and be a vital part of the team before you just throw them into it. Organizations like 4-H, I think, are fantastic. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, all of those things that are teaching the kids to develop responsibility, but are also facilitating friendships, which is the important piece there. Your families want to make other people aware of the kids' struggles, so that facilitator isn't just kind of throwing the kid to the wolves when they have specific challenges that you might struggle trying to get along with other kids initially. So for something that doesn't quite exist, there's an awful lot of information out there on it. I put my most trusty resources up there. It's what I find. There's an unlimited amount of people who have written great articles and fact sheets and ways to help families understand, which I'm grateful for, because when I get a family in my office and I have to describe this brand new thing to them, they're glazed over by the time I'm done talking. So if I can give them a short synopsis and then give them a nice little fact sheet or a website that they can refer to, and I feel much better sending them out into the rest of the world. University of Michigan has a really good website and links to more information. They had a program at one time, I don't know if that's still going on, but they were having kind of like a tutoring program for these kids. There's a lot of good information out there. And then as far as I know in the area, Lake Michigan Academy seems to be the only one who has developed a specific curriculum for NLD kids. But from what I can read, it sounds like they are reaching out to other school districts and charter schools to get this curriculum more well-established and used more often. There's a lot of books out there, guides, workbooks for teens. I had told some of my colleagues I was really looking for a video to show, just to demonstrate how people are coping. There's a lot of videos out there with people who have created their own videos to show what they're doing, how they manage. But because these people tend to be really talkative, all the videos are 12 minutes or more. So I suggest you go to YouTube and look it up. There are really good videos with kids, with adults, teens, but none that were short enough